Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Saturday. Welcome. We have two great guests, Eric Trump and the president of Hillsdale College, Larry Arnn. But before we get to our guests, America, we have a problem on our hands. Oh, I know you know, but a really big problem on our hands. We have a president of the United States who is a mobster, who embraces the Marxists and the Islamists, who embraces their anti-Semitism, who rejects Americanism. He shows it every day. It is really horrendous. But I really want to focus in on a couple issues this evening. One is the betrayal of the Jewish people in Israel, and the other is the autocratic attack on President Trump. Biden, the Democrat Party, the Marxists and the Islamists, all one, have betrayed the Jews. They're betraying Israel. They're spreading blood libels all over this country and all over the world about how Israel is protecting itself. I don't care what Joe Biden says at sacred ground at the Holocaust Museum and Memorial. He's a liar. He's a known liar. He's a psychopath. He says one thing and he does another. He has renewed these ancient blood libels against Jews. He's painted the Jewish state as a genocidal and oppressive state. He's incited a massive spread of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism throughout our universities, in fact, throughout the planet. He has emboldened Iran, Hamas, and the terrorists worldwide with his public comments. I fear he has signed the death warrant for the hostages because Hamas now knows it can do whatever it wants to the Jews, to the hostages, in any way they wish, and Joe Biden will ensure their survival. The leaders of Hamas, their money, and their 4 big battalions. Nobody is defending them more vociferously than Joe Biden. He's also signed this death warrant with the hostages while pretending he cares about them. Cares about the hostages? Does he care about the people he left behind in Afghanistan, Americans? Does he care about the Americans on the southern border and what's happening to them? Not at all. Biden has spent half a century playing the Jewish people, and he has done so every step of the way by pretending he's a Zionist, that he supports Israel, while undermining it and undermining strong prime ministers, from Menachem Begin to Netanyahu. His policies as president include attempting to remove the elected government of Israel, empowering Israel's main enemy, Iran, with billions and billions of dollars so it can arm up. He won't even attack them verbally the way he attacks Netanyahu and that government. And of course, he is doing more to destroy the state of Israel than even Israel's enemies. You know, it's one thing when you have these Islamist, mass-murdering, genocidal monsters who are out of the closet saying what they say, but it's quite another when you've relied on an ally who uses propaganda, the American press, the world press, who organize the world against you. Well, he goes to the Holocaust Museum speaking out against anti-Semitism. That is a vile, vile individual with evil intent, and that is Joe Biden today. Now, Biden's arms embargo against Israel is almost complete. Not just the 2,000-pound bombs called JDAM munitions, but also 500-pound bombs and so-called mini JDAMs, joint direct attack munitions, which converts smaller unguided bombs into precision bombs. He's also embargoing small diameter bombs, and most devastating, they're also sitting on a huge order of the most important munitions of all, tank shells and mortar rounds, which Israel bought years ago. The extent of the embargo against the Jews in Israel by Biden is extensive. Just a few weeks ago, Iran launched the biggest drone and ballistic missile attack in the history of the world against the state of Israel. Hezbollah every day is firing hundreds and hundreds of rockets that were produced in Iran and paid for Iran against the state of Israel. Israel is still taking incoming attacks from Hamas, which is also funded by Iran, Qatar, and the others. Israel's under attack from 3 enemies simultaneously, and Biden now embargoes the arms the Jews need to defend themselves. When they have the enemy surrounded, Hamas, and he is protecting them. And I said, he has signed a death warrant for those hostages. He is responsible for October 7th. He and Blinken paid for it, for the monies that have gone to Iran. They've ensured that Iran has gotten more money than Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel combined. I want you to think about that. So this embargo, I want to remind you that an embargo of this kind, for policy reasons, is an impeachable offense. First of all, we have the confession from Joe Biden himself saying what he is doing and thereby confessing to an impeachable offense. Go.
I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, they haven't gone into Rafah yet. If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities, to deal with that problem. I've made it clear to Bibi and the War Cabinet, they're not going to get our support if, in fact, they go in these population centers. We're not walking away from Israel's security. We're walking away from Israel's ability to wage war in those areas.
So it's not over your red line yet?
Not yet, but we've held up the weapons. We've held up the one shipment as an old shipment. It was designed. We've held that up.
He's a liar. He's holding up more than one shipment. You're Hamas, you're listening to this, and what are you thinking? We're safe. You can kill the hostages, keep torturing and raping them. We're not giving up any hostages, ever. Joe Biden has our back. Joe Biden's ensuring that the people who ordered the slaughter, the genocide against the Jews will be protected. He's ensured that their money will keep flowing because he's in bed with Qatar. I think his brother was even doing business with some people from Qatar. Qatar has a horrendous human rights record, which Joe Biden never talks about. It kills people, it tortures people, it enslaves people. So does Jordan. Jordan has a horrendous human rights record. It kills people, it tortures people, it enslaves people, imprisons political opponents. The king of Jordan, a pretend king of a pretend country that was created in 1947, 48, he even put his stepbrother in prison. Look at Egypt, a military dictatorship. Look at their human rights records, the killings, the imprisonment, the rounding up of Christians and so forth and so on. You never hear squat about any of it. And of course, Biden's best friend, for whom Blinken is a special pleader, Iran, their human rights record is atrocious. Again, Biden is funding that regime. No. The elected Israeli government, the people of Israel, they're the genocidal maniacs. This blood libel against the Jews is an ancient blood libel that Biden is spewing, that Blinken is spewing, that Thomas Friedman and the New York Times are spewing, that the Stalinist Bernie Sanders is spewing, that the Marxist, Islamist, Jew hater, American hater, Tlaib, and the other thugs in her group are spewing, the American media are spewing. But the withholding of funds, that's called impounding funds, and it's an impeachable offense. I want to show you a graphic from Joe Biden, October 18, 2019. President Trump withheld congressionally appropriated aid to Ukraine unless they granted him a political favor. It's the definition of a quid pro quo. This is no joke. Trump continues to put his own personal political interests ahead of the national interest. He must be impeached. Well, Joe Biden, in addition to his long-held anti-Semitism, where he's been playing the Jews for half a century, politics plays a main role in everything. Power that Biden does. Everybody knows it. That's why he kowtows to the imams, to the Jew haters. That's why he takes so long to even address them. But he does nothing about them. He hasn't told his Democrat billionaire funders, the dark money, to stop funding these groups and organizations, has he? No. He hasn't told the FBI to shut down the foreign money coming into this country to push this anti-Semitism, anti-Americanism on our college campuses from his friends in Qatar and his friends in communist China, has he? No. He didn't send the U.S. Marshals to a single college campus the way Eisenhower sent the military, the way John Kennedy sent the military to ensure that little black kids could go to school with little white kids to integrate our school system, which, by the way, Joe Biden opposed. I said he opposed. He didn't say we're insisting that Jewish kids can go on campus free of threats and violence, can go to class free of threats and violence, can attend their No, he didn't send the U.S. Marshals there. They're all busy with Donald Trump, of course. But this impoundment issue is an impeachable offense. And he just confessed to what he's doing. I have a GAO report, January 16, 2020, that Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer relied on. It's right here. In the summer of 2019, the Office of Management and Budget withheld from obligation funds appropriated to the Department of Defense for security assistance to Ukraine. This is when they were going after Trump. In order to withhold the funds, OMB issued a series of 9 apportionment schedules with footnotes that made all unobligated balances unavailable for obligation. Faithful execution of the law does not permit the president to substitute his own policy priorities for those that Congress has enacted into law. OMB withheld funds for a policy reason. That's exactly what Biden's doing. I don't want them going into Rafah. Excuse me. You're not only not a dictator in America, you're not a dictator in Israel, which is not permitted under the Impoundment Control Act, ICA, actually was passed in 1974. The withholding was not a programmatic delay. Therefore, we conclude that OMB violated the ICA, AKA violated federal law. At issue in this decision is whether OMB had authority, OMB working for the president, to withhold the USAI funds for obligation. That is funds to Ukraine. They explained the Constitution specifically vests Congress with the power of the purse, providing that, quote, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7. The Constitution also vests all legislative powers in Congress and sets forth the procedures of bicameralism and presentment through which the president may accept or veto a bill passed by both houses of Congress, and Congress may subsequently override a presidential veto. Instead, he must faithfully execute the law as Congress enacts it. Article 2, Section 3, Clause 1. An Appropriations Act is a law like any other. Therefore, unless Congress has enacted a law providing otherwise, the president must take care to ensure that the appropriations are prudently obligated during the period of availability. The Constitution grants the president no unilateral authority to withhold funds from obligation. The ICA does not permit deferrals for policy reasons. OMB's justification for withholding falls squarely within the scope of an impermissible policy deferral. Thus, the deferral of USIA funds was improper under the Act, that is, under the law. Here is Article 3, Section 3, Clause 1. It's called the Take Care Clause. We've talked about this many times with respect to Biden because he keeps violating the Constitution. President shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Is that what Joe Biden is doing? Donald Trump, who they're trying to throw in prison for nothing, and their cases are falling apart one after the other, but still, it's the process that's the issue. He put out a statement the other day, crooked Joe Biden, whether he knows it or not, just said he will withhold weapons from Israel as they fight to eradicate Hamas terrorists in Gaza. Hamas murdered thousands of innocent civilians, including babies, and are holding Americans hostage, if the hostages are still alive. Yet crooked Joe is taking the side of these terrorists, just like he has sided with the radical mobs taking over our college campuses, because his donors are funding them. Biden is weak, corrupt, and leading the world straight into World War III. Remember, this war in Israel, just like the war in Ukraine, would have never started if I was in the White House. But very soon, we will be back, and once again demanding peace through strength. But unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, Joe Biden's doing everything humanly possible to prevent that too. Now, here's some relatively good news. The case in Manhattan has been fully exposed, except, of course, to the Democrat Party grifters and the never-Trumpers, but to most rational, objective human beings, as a colossal joke, a disaster. I'm not sure who the porn star actually is in that courtroom, whether it's Stormy Daniels or the judge. To be perfectly honest with you, he must enjoy hearing what Stormy Daniels has to say, because otherwise there was no basis for anything she had to say to be allowed in that court. He's the judge, and he allowed it, and he listened to every word. You know what we used to call that where I come from? a pervert. But I dare not call a judge a pervert. This case is perverse. This case is pornography. And whether they get a conviction or not, the fact of the matter is they've convicted themselves. It's a disaster. What's happened in Florida? We have a real judge in Florida, Judge Aileen Cannon. There have been motions filed on whether or not the so-called special counsel, Jack Smith, was unconstitutionally appointed. No less than two former attorneys general, Attorney General Edwin Meese under Reagan and Attorney General Mike Mukasey under Bush, have filed Friends of the Court briefs saying his appointment violated the Constitution of the United States, the Appointments Clause. You can't just pick anybody and not run them through Congress and the process of having a nominee confirmed to conduct a trial or cases like this. And that's exactly what's happened here. There's no delegation of authority. He's not a former U.S. attorney or anything like that. Instead, he's just picked up from The Hague. Those are serious questions. There's a motion questioning on whether this is unequal treatment. That's important. She's going to hear that. There's a motion on whether or not they pressured a witness and a witness's lawyer. That's going to be reviewed. And of course, the spoliation of documents. Document case, and the government mishandled the documents. So now that's going to be looked into. In the case in Georgia, an appellate court said, wait a minute, there are a lot of issues here with respect to Fani, a.k.a. Fannie Willis, and her conduct on whether or not she should be allowed to conduct that case. That's now on appeal. And of course, the Supreme Court is looking at the issue of immunity, which it shouldn't even have to look to, but for the fact that the unconstitutionally appointed Smith has pushed the Constitution to its limits, going after Donald Trump for actions he took as president, which in my view were perfectly legal, but now to criminalize the campaign system, the entire system, so nobody actually knows how to even run a campaign or challenge the results of elections anymore, as we did in 1876 and beyond. And so that's now being examined too. Why all these court cases? Why all these issues? Because Joe Biden is behind this too. Joe Biden is a mobster. Joe Biden will do anything for power. Joe Biden will do anything to enrich himself. He is a mobster. What he's doing to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people, while pretending otherwise, is grotesque. While he is enhancing the power of Hamas, but he gave the Israelis weapons. But when Israel's ready to destroy Hamas, he's withheld the weapons. He hasn't stopped funding Iran, which is funding Hamas and funding Hezbollah and the Houthis. He hasn't stopped funding the PLO. This is who Joe Biden is. This is what Joe Biden is doing. With respect to Trump, his guy was in charge of the case involving the businesses and trying to bankrupt Trump. And now we know that judge is all conflicted. That's being investigated now. His boy is behind the case in Manhattan. We see what that's all about. It's a grotesque miscarriage of justice, a humiliation to the United States of America. His boy, the special counsel, another Democrat appointed by the Attorney General of the United States, he's all over the place, slashing and burning and shredding the Constitution as fast as he possibly can. Joe Biden is a contemptible street hack politician who's destroying our justice system, who's destroying our border and our sovereignty, who's destroying our economic system, who's destroying our voting system, who's trying to destroy our ally and destroy its leader, Netanyahu, in the state of Israel. This is what's going on in the country today. I'll be right back.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.